I don't think it's yours. The words hung in the air like a guillotine, severing the fragile thread that held their life together. Emily hadn't meant to say it, hadn't planned on uttering the confession that would tear everything apart. But as soon as the thought bubbled up, it spilled from her lips before she could stop it. She watched her husband's face crumble. His eyes, always warm and trusting, now widened in disbelief, his hands trembling on the arms of his chair, as though the truth had physically struck him. The room, their living room, which had always felt safe, familiar, suddenly seemed alien, as though the walls themselves were shifting, closing in. Michael stood up, his breath shallow, his face turning pale. "What are you saying, Emily?" Her heart pounded in her chest, the thudding so loud it drowned out the ticking of the clock on the wall. The silence that followed was suffocating, the weight of it pressing down on her lungs. She opened her mouth, tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She could feel the bile rising in her throat, shame and fear mixing together in a nauseating cocktail. She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her mind, but now that it was here, she realized there was no way to soften the blow, no way to make the betrayal easier to swallow. She clutched the arms of her chair, trying to steady herself, but her voice shook as she forced the truth out. "I'm pregnant, and it's not yours." Michael stumbled backward as if she had slapped him. His eyes blinked rapidly as though trying to clear the confusion from his mind. The man who had vowed to love her forever looked at her now like a stranger, like he couldn't recognize the woman sitting in front of him. His face, usually composed and confident, was breaking apart, the edges cracking with raw emotion. The silence that followed was deafening. "When?" His voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. Emily couldn't answer. Her throat had closed up and her eyes stung with tears. She bit her lip, trying to hold them back, but it was no use. The tears spilled over, hot and fast, blurring her vision as she watched her husband, the man she had built her entire life with, come undone before her eyes. "How long?" he pressed, his voice rising with each word. "How long have you been lying to me?" Her heart twisted painfully in her chest. She wanted to explain, wanted to tell him it wasn't like that it wasn't planned. But the truth was, she had made a choice. A selfish, reckless choice that she would live to regret for the rest of her life. She had cheated, and now the consequences were irreversible. "It was a mistake," she managed to choke out. "I didn't mean for it to happen." Michael stared at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and disgust. "Who is he?" She couldn't answer that. Not yet. Not when everything was still unraveling. Not when her entire world was crumbling beneath her feet. The name would only add more weight to the devastation, and she wasn't ready for that. She didn't know if she would ever be ready. Michael took a step closer, his fists clenched at his sides, his eyes burning with anger. "Who is he?" His voice was a low, dangerous growl, and in that moment, Emily realized the full extent of what she had done. She had taken everything they had built together, years of love, trust, commitment, and thrown it away for a fleeting moment of passion with someone who didn't matter. And now, her husband, the man who had always been her rock, her protector, was looking at her like she was nothing. She felt the weight of her guilt crushing down on her, suffocating her, but there was no escape, no way to undo the damage. "His name is Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael's face twisted into a mask of rage, his nostrils flaring as he struggled to contain the fury building inside him. "Daniel? Daniel who?" he spat, his voice shaking with rage. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her entire body trembling. "It doesn't matter, Michael. Please, let's just—" "It does matter!" he shouted, his voice reverberating through the room like thunder. "It matters more than anything!" Emily flinched at the venom in his voice. She had never seen him like this, had never seen the man she loved so consumed by anger and hurt. It was terrifying, and she didn't know how to fix it. But the truth was, she couldn't fix it. Not this time. "I didn't want it to happen," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't love him, Michael. I love you. It was a mistake. Please, we can fix this." Michael shook his head slowly, his eyes cold and distant. "How do we fix this, Emily? You're pregnant with another man's child." His voice broke, and for a brief moment she saw the pain beneath the anger, the deep, aching wound she had inflicted on him. She wanted to reach out, wanted to comfort him, but she knew it was too late. The damage was done, and nothing she could say would ever make it right. Michael ran a hand through his hair, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. "You've ruined us," he said, his voice hollow. Emily's heart shattered. She had never felt so alone, so lost. The life she had known, the life she had taken for granted, was slipping away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "Michael, please," she begged, her voice desperate. "Don't leave. We can work through this. We've been through so much together. We can survive this too." But as she looked into his eyes, she saw the truth. There was no coming back from this. Not for him, not for them. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with the weight of her betrayal and the cold, suffocating silence. It hadn't started with some grand gesture or a whirlwind romance. No, the affair had begun in the most mundane of ways, almost by accident. Daniel had been a colleague, one of the many faces she passed in the office every day. He was charming, yes, and good-looking in that easy, effortless way that made people gravitate toward him, but Emily had never thought of him in any real sense. At least, not at first. Their exchanges were polite, friendly, even casual. It wasn't until that fateful company retreat, the one Michael hadn't been able to attend because of a last-minute business trip, that things began to change. The night had started innocently enough. Drinks after the conference, a few laughs shared among coworkers. But as the hours wore on, the crowd thinned, and before she knew it, she and Daniel were sitting alone in the dimly lit bar, their conversation turning from work to more personal matters. She remembered feeling the stirrings of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Excitement? Attention? Desire? It was hard to say, but it had been intoxicating. And after a few more drinks, her inhibitions began to slip away. She wasn't thinking about Michael, about their life together, about the vows they had exchanged. In that moment, it had been easy to forget. One thing led to another, and before she even knew how it happened, they were sneaking out of the hotel, Daniel's hand on the small of her back, leading her to his room. There was a rush of adrenaline, a forbidden thrill that clouded her judgment, made her feel invincible. It had only been one night, one stupid, reckless night, but it was enough to change everything. The next morning, as she lay in Daniel's bed, the weight of what she had done crashed down on her. She had betrayed her husband, the man she loved more than anything in the world. Panic set in, and she left the room without a word, fleeing back to her own hotel room as if she could outrun the guilt. She swore it would never happen again. She promised herself it had been a mistake, a lapse in judgment that she would take to her grave. She went back to her normal life, throwing herself into her marriage with renewed effort, determined to make things right. She told herself that as long as Michael never found out, they could still be happy. But the guilt gnawed at her, festering like an open wound. Every time she looked at Michael, every time he smiled at her or kissed her goodnight, the guilt threatened to choke her. She started avoiding Daniel at work, keeping her distance, pretending like nothing had ever happened. And for a while, it worked. The affair became a distant memory, something she could almost convince herself had never happened. Until the pregnancy test. Emily stared at the small white stick in her hand, her heart pounding in her chest as the two pink lines appeared. Panic gripped her like a vice, and her knees buckled as the realization set in. She was pregnant, with his child. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of it. She and Michael had been trying for a baby for months, but what should have been a joyous moment quickly turned into a nightmare. She had been careful with Daniel, hadn't she? The night they'd spent together had been reckless, yes, but she had never imagined this could be the consequence. How could she tell Michael? How could she look him in the eyes and pretend everything was normal when she was carrying another man's baby? Emily sat on the cold bathroom floor, her knees drawn to her chest, staring at the pregnancy test as though it might somehow change if she willed it hard enough. But the lines were still there. The two bright pink lines that confirmed her worst fear. She was pregnant with Daniel's child. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, but time felt frozen. She couldn't move, couldn't think. Her mind was a chaotic storm of emotions, fear, guilt, and a desperate need to find a way out. What was she going to do? Telling Michael had always been the plan. He was her husband, the man she had built her life with. For years, they had tried for a baby. They had sat in doctors' offices, cried over negative tests, shared whispered hopes late at night in bed. A baby was supposed to be a gift, a symbol of their love. But now, that dream was warped by a single night of betrayal. She thought of Daniel, his smile, his easy charm, how he had made her feel that night. Important. Desired. She hadn't realized how lonely she'd been until he came into her life, but she hadn't wanted this. Not really. A fleeting affair was one thing, but a child? A living, breathing reminder of the worst mistake she had ever made? She pulled herself up from the floor and splashed cold water on her face, trying to clear her head. She had to think. What were her options? Could she keep the secret? Could she pretend the baby was Michael's and never let him know the truth? The thought was tempting, almost seductive in its simplicity. Michael would never have to know. They could raise the child together, and maybe, just maybe, she could bury the guilt deep enough that it wouldn't consume her. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't work. The lie would fester, eating away at her, at their marriage, until there was nothing left but resentment and pain. And what if the baby looked like Daniel? What if it inherited his eyes, his smile? How long before Michael figured it out? Emily sat down at the kitchen table, her mind racing. There was another option, one that had crossed her mind several times, but every time she had pushed it away. Abortion. It seemed so final, so wrong. But wasn't her entire situation wrong? Could ending the pregnancy erase her mistake? Could it give her and Michael a chance to rebuild what they had? She felt sick at the thought. She wasn't ready to make that decision, but time was slipping away. She needed to tell Michael. She needed to tell him everything. When Michael came home that evening, Emily could barely look at him. The weight of her guilt pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. He kissed her on the cheek, oblivious to the storm raging inside her, and she felt the bile rise in her throat. "How was your day?" he asked, dropping his keys on the counter. Emily swallowed hard. "We need to talk." Michael turned to face her, his brow furrowing with concern. "What's wrong?" She could feel the tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She had to be strong, had to face this head on. I'm pregnant," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael's face lit up with a mixture of shock and joy. "You're pregnant?" He reached out and took her hands in his, squeezing them gently. "Emily, that's amazing." She couldn't hold back the tears anymore. They spilled over, running down her cheeks as she looked up at him, the man she loved more than anything, the man she had betrayed. "It's not yours," she said, her voice breaking. Michael froze, his hand still holding hers, but the warmth had drained from his face. His eyes, filled with confusion, locked onto hers. "What do you mean it's not mine?" Emily pulled her hands away, unable to bear the hurt she saw in his eyes. I made a mistake," she whispered. "It was just one night, Michael. I didn't mean for it to happen, and I never thought—" "Who?" His voice was cold, sharp. The joy from moments ago had evaporated, replaced by something dark and unfamiliar. "Daniel," she said, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. "It's Daniel's baby." Michael stepped back, as though her words had physically pushed him away. His face twisted with anger, betrayal, and something else. Something she had never seen before. Disgust. "How could you?" he asked, his voice trembling with rage. "How could you do this to us? To me?" Emily tried to reach for him, but he recoiled, as though her touch would burn him. "Michael, please, I'm sorry. I never meant for it to happen. I love you. You're the one I love." His laugh was bitter, cold. "Love. You don't betray someone you love, Emily. You don't destroy everything you've built for a fling with some coworker." He turned away, his hands clenched into fists, trying to hold himself together. "I thought we were a team, Emily. I thought we were building a family together. We can still—" "No," Michael cut her off, his voice hard as stone. "We can't." Emily's heart shattered. She had known this would happen, but hearing the finality in his voice broke her in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had lost him. Everything they had built, the life they had shared, it was gone. All because of her. Michael walked to the door, grabbing his jacket off the chair. "I can't do this right now," he said, his voice hollow. "I need time to think. Don't try to call me." And just like that, he was gone. The weeks that followed Michael's departure were a blur of guilt and loneliness. Emily was left to face the wreckage of her life alone, haunted by the echoes of her own choices. Michael had moved out, staying with a friend to give himself time to think, and in his absence, the silence of their once happy home felt like a prison. Emily hadn't heard from Daniel. The last time they had spoken was months ago, when she had made it clear that their night together had been a mistake. She hadn't told him about the baby, hadn't even considered it. But now, as her pregnancy progressed, she knew she couldn't avoid him forever. He had a right to know, even if she didn't want him involved. She had thought about terminating the pregnancy more than once, the thought gnawing at her in the quiet moments of the night. But every time she considered it, she felt a wave of nausea, not just from the pregnancy itself, but from the idea of erasing her mistake by destroying a life. In the end, she couldn't bring herself to do it. The baby was innocent in all of this, a life that didn't ask to be born into a web of lies. One rainy afternoon, she found herself standing outside Daniel's office, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't seen him since the retreat, hadn't spoken to him since that awful night. But she had to tell him. He deserved to know. When he opened the door, he looked surprised to see her. "Emily, is everything okay?" She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Can we talk?" Daniel led her inside, shutting the door behind them. They sat across from each other, the awkward tension in the air palpable. Emily clasped her hands in her lap, trying to steady her nerves. "I'm pregnant," she blurted out, her voice trembling. Daniel's eyes widened in shock, his mouth opening slightly before he closed it again. "Wait, what? You're pregnant?" She nodded, biting her lip. "It's yours." The room fell into a heavy silence as Daniel tried to process what she had just said. He ran a hand through his hair, clearly overwhelmed. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Emily said quickly. "I just thought you should know. I'm not asking for anything from you, but I thought you deserved to know the truth." Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Emily, I don't know what to do with this. I'm not I'm not ready to be a father. She nodded. I know. I'm not asking you to be. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The weight of the situation was too heavy, too complicated to navigate. Emily could feel the walls closing in, her world narrowing to this one impossible truth. There was no escaping the consequences of her actions. Months passed, and the baby grew inside her, a constant reminder of everything she had lost. Michael had filed for divorce, the final blow to the life they had shared. He couldn't forgive her, and she couldn't blame him. In his eyes, she had broken something that could never be fixed. The day her daughter was born, Emily held her in her arms, staring down at the tiny face, the small, delicate hands. She was beautiful, innocent, and pure in a way that made Emily's heart ache. The baby was a reminder of her mistakes, yes, but she was also a new beginning, a chance to love and protect someone, even if it was born from her greatest regret. Emily named her Lily. In the years that followed, Emily rebuilt her life, brick by painful brick. She found a new job, a new place to live. She and Daniel remained distant, co-parenting in the most basic of terms. He wasn't ready for fatherhood, but he visited when he could, and they made it work for Lily's sake. As for Michael, he moved on. She heard through mutual friends that he had remarried, had a child of his own. Emily wished him happiness, even though the pain of losing him would never fully fade. But every night, when she tucked Lily into bed, she reminded herself that life could still be beautiful, even after everything fell apart. And as she watched her daughter grow, Emily lived with the regret of her past, but also with the hope of the future she was determined to build, one filled with love, honesty, and the lessons learned from her mistakes.